Hello everyone, it's great to have you back again. I'm going to examine a piece of twisted, dishonest and manipulative writing done by some ALP supporters. The reason this writing is important is because it exposes the tribal thinking of the ALP. It shows how if you don't agree with the ALP narrative and dogma, you're completely excluded and not part of their team. Still worse, if you don't see things as they do, you're ridiculed, and nothing you have to say is given any credibility. This kind of behaviour, this them and us attitude, is seen throughout this article. What it is fanatical, cult-like thinking, and you're either part of their tribe or seen as part of the great unwashed. It is really a type of sick fanaticism. This article is so twisted you can use their own writing to show that what they're saying is most likely not true, but is most likely a perverse interpretation of what really happened. The writers pretend to be honest, truthful and reasonable, but in reality they're nothing of the sort. They ridicule people who oppose them. They laugh at people who hold different views and scorn public figures who think differently. Let's get started. This article is from the same website I mentioned in my previous video. It was published by the same people who sell those stickers telling people not to trust or read the Melbourne Sun, the Australian, or listen to Sky News Australia. I've linked to this article at point 1 in the description below. It breaks down into two parts. The first part refers to an incident at a football game in the UK where many people lost their lives. It complains about the way the UK Sun reported the incident. Apparently the UK Sun was heavily criticised and rejected by many people who live in the city of Liverpool, where the incident happened. We'll go into detail about this shortly. In the next part, they criticise the Melbourne Sun newspaper along similar lines for the way it reported the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. They say their reporting was extremely inappropriate and driven by the worst possible motives, and the Melbourne Sun should also be rejected by the people of Melbourne, just as they say the people of Liverpool rejected the UK Sun. Now let's look into the details. The UK Sun reported the deaths of 96 people in a crowd crush at the Hillsborough Football Stadium back in 1989. They reported that during this incident, some of the fans picked the pockets of victims. Some fans urinated on police doing their job, and some fans even beat up a police officer giving the kiss of life to a victim. Current-day ALP supporters are outraged that the UK Sun would publish such things. To these ALP supporters, it was cold-hearted beyond belief. The writers today then start telling the UK Sun what their job should have been and what they should have done some 30 years ago. They say the UK Sun should have acted more like counsellors to the public that reassured and tried to unite people, and certainly not say such painful things during a time of national crisis and mourning. But the UK Sun apparently saw their job differently. The UK Sun may have reasoned something along these lines. Are journalists really qualified to practice counselling? And what is the job of a newspaper anyway? The UK Sun might also have thought that if they didn't report the incident correctly, then they might also have been criticised by other sections of the public for not doing their job. So how may the UK Sun have seen its job? Most likely, well to me anyway, the newspaper saw their job to tell the truth as best they could about the incident. Now we know how hollow and empty that sounds today. Many people know that newspapers have become so corrupted by government and big business interests that it's hard sometimes to tell what is propaganda, self-interest or truth. But I think most people would still say the job of a newspaper should be to tell the truth about what happened, sometimes even if the truth is unpleasant. We see the ALP supporters who wrote this article say nothing of it was true. To them, what the UK Sun said was just all lies. But was it all lies? Their own article says that some fans who helped pull each other to safety, while the actual guilty party behind the crush, that is, the South Yorkshire Police, stood by and watched and refused to help. So the police stood by and didn't do their job, or at least did not do what the people expected. I think it would be safe to say that some in the crowd may have seen all this. Some may have even appealed to the police to do something. Consider how you'd respond if you yourself had to go and rescue people while the police stood by and did nothing. I'm sure you'd get a bit annoyed, to say the least. And so it's not that hard to think that some in the crowd might have taken matters into their own hands and decided to teach the police a lesson, or at least to show their disgust towards the police. So we can see from the ALP supporters' own article that there is some evidence that what the UK Sun reported might actually have been true. It may not have been all lies, as the ALP writers say. Of course, we can't be sure. What we really need to know is what came out in the days after the incident. Usually the truth surfaces in some place one way or another. Oddly, the ALP supporters who wrote this article mention nothing of what came out afterwards. And considering that this incident took place in 1989, surely enough time has elapsed for the truth to have come out. The ALP supporters just state that it was all lies and leave it at that, making no reference to anything that surfaced afterwards. So what we can see is those who go against the left-wing narrative are despised by the left, and there's no attempt at all to see things from another person's perspective. This is not normal. This is not healthy. Usually others give the benefit of the doubt and think that there could be some truth in what they say, but not these ALP supporters. What these ALP supporters don't comprehend is that newspapers have their own view of what their job is and how it should be done, as most people do today. And it seems back in 1989, the UK Sun went about doing what they saw was their job and reported what they saw was the truth, which turns out may well have been what happened. Now let's move on to the second part of the article. These ALP supporters next apply the same argument, cookie-cutter style, to the Melbourne Sun. They criticise the Melbourne Sun for being heartless, disruptive and provocative during the Melbourne pandemic lockdowns, and then say the people of Melbourne should also throw the Melbourne Sun out of town, as they say the people of Liverpool did to the UK Sun. Their basic claim is this. They say once the virus escaped from the quarantine hotels, the only option available for the people of Melbourne was to knuckle down and meticulously follow the directives of the Andrews government. They say that was the only way to defeat the virus. Really? They continue and say the Melbourne Sun refused to follow the directives of the Andrews government, and so the Melbourne Sun fomented unrest among the population, questioned what Daniel Andrews did, called him a tyrant only out for power, and then encouraged people to protest. They say the Melbourne Sun was not working for the good of Melbourne, but were playing politics with the lives of the people of Melbourne during the pandemic. They say the Andrews government did make mistakes, but they were just innocent mistakes anyone could have made during a time of distress. Of course, the Melbourne Sun saw their job differently. They saw their job was to hold the Andrews government to account. They claimed Daniel Andrews was not managing the pandemic well, refused to be accountable, and refused to be transparent with the public. They saw it was their job as a newspaper to focus attention on all of this. Many would agree that this is the job of a newspaper in a democracy. Newspapers have consistently said in the past on Melbourne television that their job is to hold the government accountable, and so that is what the Melbourne Sun did. The fact that other Melbourne newspapers defended Daniel Andrews and his actions speaks more about their shortcoming and bias, and not of them being good newspapers. Saying the Melbourne Sun stirred up dissent among the population comes from the point of view that people should not question the government, but instead should meticulously obey the government, something the ALP holds very dear. So what did the Melbourne Sun think they needed to report? The ALP writers of this article refused to see that it was Daniel Andrews himself who deliberately let the virus escape from the quarantine hotels. Don't believe me? Please see the link at video 2 in the description. The first outbreak of the virus in Victoria was at the Cedar Meats abattoir in West Melbourne. Workers at Cedar Meats were known to be infected and carriers of the virus. What Daniel Andrews did was simply terrible. The Deputy Health Minister, Annalise Van Diemen, wrote a directive to the security companies at the quarantine hotels, telling them to let the Cedar Meats workers leave the quarantine hotels if they wished. For everyone else, the quarantine hotels were mandatory, but for the Cedar Meats workers, the quarantine hotels were entirely voluntary. Cedar Meats workers could return home to their families and friends, carrying the virus to whoever they came in contact with. Don't believe me? Look at the video in link 2. The written directive is referenced in this video. It was also submitted to the Coat Inquiry. The security company said it was the most dangerous thing in their submission. Why on earth would Daniel Andrews allow a thing like that to happen? We can be reasonably sure that Annalise Van Diemen and Brett Sutton, her boss, the health minister, did not write that directive independently and on their own authority. Both were trained medical professionals and would know that directive was going to sabotage and undermine the whole purpose of the quarantine hotels that the government was trying to get going at the time. So why would they put their careers at risk by doing such a stupid thing on their own authority? I think they would have only issued it if directed to do so, and then only under duress. And the only person who could have directed them was Daniel Andrews himself. Go and see the video for yourself. Go to 11 minutes 8 seconds in and watch up to 19 minutes 20 seconds. Why on earth would Daniel Andrews want to sabotage the work of the quarantine hotels? The only thing I can think of was that he wanted to do a special favour for his trade union supporter base. Of course, the fanatical ALP writers failed to tell you this in their article. It appears the Melbourne Sun had valid concerns about what the government was doing, and Daniel Andrews himself was the main reason for their concerns. He provides the best example of why governments must be questioned, doubted, and held to account. So what else may the Melbourne Sun have seen needed reporting? Under the Australian Constitution, we have the right of free speech to speak about political leaders and political matters. Some people were obeying all the government directives, but were also carrying a sign protesting against Daniel Andrews. The police arrested them. So why were they arrested when others around them were not? It was because they carried a sign protesting Daniel Andrews. And we were also told that we could ride our bicycles and exercise without face masks. But we have a video of a crazed officer trying to arrest a cyclist who was not wearing a face mask. These were examples of fraud, corruption, and government overreach that needed to be held up to the public. Again, we see these ALP writers only seeing ALP dogma and ALP narrative. Here we have the fanatical, cult-like thinking of the ALP, exposed for all to see. They have a them or us attitude. You are either part of their tribe and acquiesce in obedience to all their nonsense, or you are a corrupt, perverse individual. Thank you again for your time. Stay well and stay safe.